there's a world of trade that the US isn't involved in. And if anything, that trade has gotten stronger this year than it was when we spoke a year ago on the outlook. I think that's clear.
If you're entering negotiations for another freight contract in 2026, which a lot of shippers will be doing, you kind of don't know what you're going to be shipping.
The clear message now is we're seeing spot rates fall back to levels where they were at the end of 2023, before we got this TEU boost for the Red Sea. Carriers were maybe hoping that this would keep rates up a higher level, but at the moment it's not.
Welcome to The Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistics leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. I'm joined again by my co-host, Emily Stausbøll, Xeneta Senior Shipping Analyst. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Phil. Ready to go again?
Indeed. Bit of a special episode of The Freight Debate this week. Because myself and Emily, along with our Xeneta colleagues, will be heading to Barcelona on Thursday and Friday for the annual Xeneta Summit, with hundreds of industry stakeholders, colleagues, friends, to talk about the industry. And every year, to coincide with the summit, we produce, with the help of Emily and Peter Sand, our chief shipping analyst, should I say, we produce a outlook for the year ahead. So the outlook, Xeneta Outlook Ocean 2026, is now published. You can download it from our website. And today's episode of the Freight Debate, we will dive into that outlook a little bit more with Emily's help, and give you a little bit of a sneak preview of what you can expect for 2026. How does that sound, Emily?
It sounds good. And it's good because this is clearly one of the big topics for discussion at Summit. So we're speaking now, recording this beforehand. And then come Summit, I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussions with people agreeing, disagreeing, and thinking we're completely off. So maybe we can come back with an update on that once we've been to Barcelona and back.
Well, exactly. I think if we were recording this after the summit, we'd both be looking and sounding a lot more tired than we are. We're still in the phase of kind of, excitement. After we'll be very tired, but it's a fantastic event, isn't it? For anyone that's been, and really looking forward to it again this year. So 2026, it doesn't feel 5 minutes since we were publishing the last Outlook. Some of the themes will be familiar from the 2025 Outlook, some of them a little bit new, but we'll go through them one at a time. We have 6 themes for 2026. Should we dive in there, Emily, with theme number 1?
Yeah, maybe just before we do that, just to pick up, you say some of the themes are similar to what we had last year in the 2025 Outlook. But actually, in many ways, some of the themes are also similar to what we had in the 2024 Outlook, published back in 2023, when we were talking about a general softening in the market. Spot rates on those main trades were kind of where they are now. And we were talking about a year that looked like a year it was better to be a shipper than a carrier. And of course, 2024 turned out very differently. So we also have to just think about this as similar to what we were saying in 2023. Of course, different dynamics, and we'll get into that. But a lot can happen without us. We can't predict everything, unfortunately.
Yeah, we could have saved ourselves a huge amount of work and just republished the 2024 Outlook, Emily, for 2026. Because it is, for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, it is an incredible amount of work to put this Outlook together, because we're trying to distill down global supply chains and geopolitics and such like into one document. So Emily and Peter have had the work cut out, but it's a really valuable document, and we get huge amounts of downloads every single year from people that want to know what Emily and Peter think.
Hopefully this year it won't be out of date before we actually get to the 1st of January, like it was in 2024, because that feels harsh. So fingers crossed this time.
It does, and maybe that this is a good point to just put a little disclaimer in there. That as knowledgeable and the expertise of Emily and Peter, this isn't a crystal ball, is it? This is the best forecast that we can possibly have based on the data and intelligence and the geopolitical climate as we know it at the moment. But as you say, as we've seen in previous years, even the great Emily Stausbøll
I have to
kind of
stop you there, Phil,
can't
because that's
can't, can't necessarily predict what's going to happen in the Red Sea or the Middle East or Russia, Ukraine,
the
or
White House.
what Trump's going to do, or the White House. So, we do need to make that clear. But that being said, it is still a hugely valuable look forward to 2026. So we've skirted around it anyway.
Let's
Let's
go.
dive in there. The first theme of the 6 is the macro outlook. Always a good place to start. And this theme is titled around the exceptional factors that have disrupted ocean container shipping in recent years, as we've just kind of alluded to, actually, will stabilize in 2026, or at least not get any worse. So could you put some kind of more meat on the bones with that one?
Yeah, to the best of our knowledge, right? But let's just set the scene. Container shipping is very price inelastic. The rates have very little impact really on demand. Demand is purely driven by macroeconomics. Of course, in the extremes, when you were getting an offer of 15,000, then that's an issue. But the rest of the time, demand is really based on global trade, and that's naturally then based on global GDP growth. And we lean quite heavily on the International Monetary Fund and their forecasts for next year. Which looks like it's going to be better next year than it was this year. But for us, what's really interesting is this trade to GDP multiplier. So it's one thing to have GDP growth. It's another how that translates then into container growth. And for the past 2 years, that multiplier has been above 1. So 1% GDP growth leads to over 1% trade growth. Whereas we're seeing that coming now back down to 1. So that 3% to 3.1% GDP growth globally, which is what the IMF has, translates into our kind of expectations of 3% demand growth in the market. And that is largely that multiplier coming down because of a slowdown in the US and also a little bit in European imports. And those two sort of big economies that really drive global trade with all their imports, the slowing there is enough to pull the multiplier down, even as we see growth in volumes in much of the rest of the world. That's kind of the headline of this GDP to trade multiplier coming back down to 1. And also in part because of the front loading we've had this year. You don't need to import so much next year. And presumably when eventually we see these tariffs coming through onto US consumer prices, that will also reduce their spending.
So yeah, if I can just throw something back at you based on that multiplier, because obviously GDP growth and activity and manufacturing activity is fundamental to driving container shipping demand. But in recent years, that relationship's been severed a little bit, hasn't it? Because it hasn't really been that underlying GDP growth, because we're looking at these other factors, whether it's Red Sea or whether it's the tariffs or whatever it may be. They're the thing that's driving ocean container demand, whether it's shippers panicking about supply chain resilience and such like. So this theme is around those factors as well, isn't it? In terms of as well as that underlying macro kind of situation.
Yeah, and you can take that back to the pandemic as well, where suddenly actually consumer spending on goods was suddenly a much larger share of consumer spending because you weren't spending so much on services. So you were getting more consumer goods driven by imports. And of course, that means that you get more trade growth than sort of consumer spending would indicate. So it's a much, much longer term perspective. And then you get front loading, you get all this other stuff playing in. And this is still very tricky to read because we still, we're 3 months away from 2026. And then there's 12 months there where things can develop with tariffs or whatever else. But it is a longer term trend that we now kind of see ending and getting back to a multiplier of about 1.
Yeah. And if you're a shipper, then you just said there it's hard to read, and it is. So for shippers, they may be in an uncertain period as well, where they're looking forward to 2026 and they don't really know what's going to happen with inflation in the US, for example, or consumer spending in the US on different types of goods, whether it's luxury goods or more, essential goods. They may not know what volume. So we're trying to look at a kind of global macro level here, aren't we? But maybe even individual shippers don't necessarily know what volumes they're going to be moving in 2026 either.
No, they're far from it, especially with, I mean, what comes to mind here is the 50% tariffs on India. Is that something that holds for the next 3 months into 2026? And if it doesn't, how soon does it get through 2026? All these kind of things. And then actually, to what extent do shippers and do these companies pass on those cost increases to US consumers? Because at the moment, the tariffs don't look to have had a huge effect. But that's largely because there are some companies in the middle kind of absorbing those costs. That isn't going to go on forever either. And we're still waiting to see those effects really filter through into US consumer spending.
Yeah, and just to, we'll try and round off each section, each theme of the outlook with a little bit of kind of advice or guidance or intelligence for shippers. And if we take that idea of they don't necessarily know what volumes they're shipping next year, or the markets that they're going to be more successful or less successful in next year, or what consumer spending is going to be like in the US, or what inflation is going to be like in the US. So if you're entering negotiations for another freight contract in 2026, which a lot of shippers will be doing, you kind of don't know what you're going to be shipping. So it's going to come down to your T&Cs in contracts, presumably, and flexibility around volumes, minimum quantity commitments, and things like that.
Absolutely. It's about kind of building that flexibility in and making sure both when it comes to price, but also on those minimum volume commitments, and making sure you have that partnership, whether it's a carrier or freight forwarder, and you can say, okay, I know we said maybe 50 containers a week, but I need to bring that all forward to March because I can see a new tariff coming through in April. So let's do 100 containers a week in March and something else in April. And that is something that's going to be balanced. And because you won't be the only one doing that. It's not like you will magically, one person needs to move more in May and the other person in April and you can cover it. A lot of this stuff is happening kind of simultaneously for many countries, and that just makes it trickier. But overall, to us, the macro outlook looks like it's more stable than it has been in previous years. We kind of know that tariffs is a huge disruptive factor, and that's definitely not going away. But hopefully that is kind of the major thing, and hopefully we don't see. I mean, we're 6 months on to the day when we're recording this from Liberation Day. So hopefully the next kind of 12 months and into the end of 2026, we'll see a more stable situation than we've got for the past 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, just to round off this theme, it could be the biggest kind of, looking back with kind of through my fingers, but you wouldn't think that the tariff situation in 2026 could be more extreme than it was in 2025. I mean, it would have to be going some, wouldn't it? So in that respect, then there's not stability, but there's more kind of stability than we've had previously.
Fingers crossed.
Well, I could look back on that and think, oh my God, I can't believe I said it. So that's theme 1 done. Thank you, Emily. Theme 2 of the Xeneta Ocean Outlook 2026 is geopolitics, and the fact that trade will remain at the centre of conflict. And we've just touched upon it there anyway, in terms of tariffs. But it's not just about tariffs. So could you, again, give us a little bit of a understanding of this theme, Emily?
If we just take a look above tariffs, we've clearly got the port fees that they're scheduled to go into place in 1 week, there's a lot of talk around there. I think at the moment what we're seeing is carriers are not being able to pass the costs on. And that is, in a falling market, they're going to struggle passing costs on, whether they just want a rate increase or they can justify them with this. But clearly COSCO in particular is going to be hard hit. Most other carriers are able to kind of redeploy their fleet to avoid them. We've seen in recent days a very interesting kind of retaliatory measures from China, which are very broad, and the potential disruptive factor is, I think it's huge because it can go much higher than just carrier level stuff. But to me, that suggests that they are wanting to go to the negotiating table, and this should be seen on the same table as when they negotiate tariffs. This is another card to pull, and we might see some changes there. But it's an interesting thing just to keep in mind. We've got Red Sea, we'll come into that in a moment. We've also got, and that is the IMO, the decarbonization policy, where the US again is using tariffs as kind of a threat, saying, if you vote for these decarbonization regulations, they are threatening to put tariffs in place on any country that votes for it at this UN body, which would also be hugely disruptive. So definitely a continuation of tariffs being brought in as more than just trade, but also as kind of retaliation for other non-trade areas. But again, it's hard for us. So it's clearly one of those where it's hard for us to predict everything that will happen, because there's just so much stuff going on.
Yeah, I agree with that, but there is a guiding principle here, or not necessarily principle, but there's a guiding kind of position that the global superpowers are taking, whether that's China or the US, is that trade is effectively weaponized in the power struggle between these two nations for kind of supremacy, really, isn't it? And that is the way it is. And however that manifests, whether it's port fees or whether it's tariffs or whether it's China passing legislation so we can take kind of reciprocal measures, or we've seen trade being at the center of conflict through a kind of struggle for control of maritime infrastructure, sort of control of ports, whether that's in Panama Canal or wherever it is. We don't necessarily know where this is going to manifest, but it is clear, isn't it, that all sides see trade as maybe a weapon is too strong, but a tool to further their own kind of policies and position themselves in the way they want to be positioned on a global stage.
And I think, absolutely, I think there's a very obvious example of this, and that is how China is going about its agricultural goods. And they've basically, like they did in 2018, 2019, tried to reduce as much as possible their soybean imports and their other agricultural goods. And that hits hard in a lot of kind of the Trump supporting states. And they're talking now in the US about getting a package for them. This is China going above just putting in tariffs, but saying, actually, we as a nation want to reduce this because we know this will hurt where Trump voters are already vulnerable and will need more help.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. And just to round off this theme with maybe just a little bit of kind of shipper insight or guidance, and I'll return to what I just said around we don't necessarily know how these geopolitical power struggles will surface, but we know they're going to surface, and we know that trade is likely to be the weapon or tool that is used. It's going to be center stage, isn't it? So if you're a shipper, you kind of know it's going to be coming, but maybe they've learned, or have they learned from the tariffs in 2025, so they're better able to use data intelligence to react in 2026, or from when services were rerouted around Africa following Red Sea. So I think, is it a case of don't forget the lessons that you've learned from the past few years?
Don't forget the lessons you've learned, and then just because it doesn't look identical to what had happened in the past years doesn't mean you can't also react to it. So try and think back, okay, what worked best for us in that situation? Why would this work this time? What should we change? So even though it's not kind of, okay, well, we did ABC last year, let's do that again, you can take the learnings from there and say, okay, how does this apply to this new situation, even if we haven't experienced this particular thing before? Excellent.
Okay, that's theme 2 done. Theme 3 of 6 for the 2026 Xeneta Ocean Outlook. Let's look at demand a little more closely, and specifically the shifting global trade patterns. And this follows nicely on from the macro and then the geopolitical aspects onto, how is this actually impacting the way that containerized goods are flowing around the world into different markets, such like. So Emily, again, could you put a little bit of colour onto this theme for us?
So headline number was the 3% we got earlier from a trade to GDP multiplier of 1, giving us 3% trade growth for the next year. I think what we are seeing in the data more and more, and the issue is a little bit, the data is obviously quite slow. So we're looking at data that kind of dates back still to the summer months is what we have at the moment. And for example, from US imports from India, that's still up because of the front loading. It has yet to show that big drop. But we definitely expect that drop, and we're definitely seeing a broadening out of markets. So we've talked for many years about China +1, and that's certainly from the US side, kind of saying, where can we source other than China? That has been made more complicated by these tariffs hitting a range of other countries. And so often the investments you might have made during the first part of the trade war, or the first trade war in Trump's first term, you made investments in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, kind of the obvious example, and that's suddenly with high tariffs and these extra potential tariffs for transshipment. But on the other end, you're also looking at the rest of the world saying we want a US +1 strategy and saying, okay, we can source the US, but we need to find other markets as well. And that's most obvious with China. So Chinese exports to the US, I believe, are down 11% in the first 7 months of this year, likely to be even worse as we come into the sort of last months of the year as that post front loading surge comes in. But total Chinese exports are up 5.5 or 5.8%, I think it is. So they're clearly quite successful in finding new markets, and it's basically everywhere they're growing to. So I think it was about 770,000 TU they've lost in exports to the US. They made up for that purely with higher exports to Europe, but also they've increased the exports to Southeast Asia, to South Africa, South and Central America. So they are finding more and more buyers. Some of those goods will end up in the US through slightly murky transshipment arrangements, but a lot of this is also just demand growth that China has been investing in a lot of these countries for a while to build up those markets.
Yeah. Is it, I mean, when I look at those figures, so as you say, I'm just looking at them now. So 777,000 TU drop in exports to North America, but Europe up 790,000. So near as damn it, the scales are balanced. I mean, is it not incredibly impressive that China have been able to effectively being so agile? I mean, we're talking as a nation, but the shippers out of China have been able to kind of turn off that tap and turn on that tap in what is effectively a really short period of time. Actually, or is it a case of these goods are still going where they were always going to go, maybe just through, maybe a different means or a different route?
There's definitely a share of that, but by no means enough to sort of justify the scale of this. But it's obvious that we had talk in Europe about putting in some anti-dumping tariffs on, for example, steel or other products that are suddenly coming in much cheaper from China because they're really just sending stuff they would have sent. So it's a bit of a mixture of everything. And also we should say it's not like Chinese exports to the rest of the world weren't growing before 2025. They were already growing fast, and we could see that. But clearly this shift has jigged it up. I think we still are waiting a little bit, and I'm talking about data from, say, September onwards, where we'll start to be able to see a little bit more what the new baseline is. Because when we talk about the first 7 months of the year, that is 2-ish months of normal exports, 2 months of the full, it's very hard to make sense of the numbers when you look at this overall. But once we get kind of September, October, and the rest of the year data and into 2026, we'll be able to see more clearly how much of this is a sustained difference in trade and how much of it isn't.
Yeah. I mean, again, looking at the charts, Australasia up, Europe up, within the Far East up, and these are China exports, should I say, within the Far East up, India subcontinent and Middle East up, South and Central America up, Sub-Saharan Africa up. The only one that's down is North America. So tariffs clearly have had a massive impact.
There's a world of trade that the US isn't involved in, and if anything, that trade has gotten stronger this year than it was when we spoke a year ago on the outlook. I think that's clear. Now there's a nuance there, because we're talking about, okay, well, they've made up the volumes, Chinese exports are growing great. But for container shipping, and we'll come on to talk about the transport work when it comes to Red Sea, but if you think about it on a map, if you're exporting from China, North America is basically as far away as you can get. So a container going from China to the US is generating a lot of TU miles, and a lot more than a container going to Southeast Asia, to Europe, to Sub-Saharan Africa, everywhere else. So for container shipping, some volumes are more useful to carriers than others. The longer the front haul distance, the better. Then, of course, volume growth on backhauls, which we're not expecting really, but that doesn't really matter because those ships have to sail back anyway. So carriers will maybe make up slightly more of the lost costs there, but not hugely. So TEU mile terms, this actually translates to slightly under 3% growth because of these shifts with where containers are being, or how far containers are being moved.
There's always a nuance, isn't there? Nothing's ever quite as it seems.
Should never be simple.
It'd never be simple. No, it certainly isn't. Let's round off this theme. It's a really interesting theme, isn't it? And some really startling stats in there. If you're a shipper, I suppose the big thing here is that, as you say, many of them will have adopted a China plus one strategy back in 2018, 2019, when the tariff kind of regime of Donald Trump first ramped up. Maybe those maybe that China plus one strategy, where you're opening up new sourcing or manufacturing centers in Vietnam or Cambodia or wherever, maybe they've been undermined a little bit. But again, it's similar to geopolitics. There's still an underlying premise here of importance and flexibility and keeping your options open in supply chains if you can. Not all shippers. It's not easy to do, is it? It's easy to sit here and say, "Oh, just have another factory somewhere." That's not very easy. But again, there's this kind of underlying truth here, isn't it? Of flexibility in supply chains is going to be really important when you're facing these shifting trade patterns.
Yeah, and it's hard to keep up. I mean, for shippers in the investments, but also for carriers, when suddenly you're getting very strong growth on particular trades, maybe out of particular evens, possibly where you haven't got the infrastructure to handle 10% plus year-on-year growth, because that is a lot to demand. So there's a lot of different things at play, and both on the shipper side figuring out, okay, how do we want to set it up, and then carriers trying to adapt to that demand change. And there's no reason that they would not try and work because they want these containers, but it's not easy to kind of predict these things, and you can't just click your fingers and a ship will appear in Cambodia because that's where you suddenly need it. It has to be coming from somewhere else or taken off another trade.
Wonderful. Theme 3 done. Next theme 4 out of 6 on the Xeneta Ocean Outlook 2026. Again, is around demand, but it leads on nicely from the last theme. It's almost like we planned the order of these themes, Emily.
Us planning things.
So it flows very nicely. And it's a game based on demand, but it's around the Red Sea. And you touched on it just now around the longer sailing distances between China and the US, increasing transport work for the global fleet. And the same is true, isn't it, when we still look at the impact of the Red Sea and ships continuing to divert around Cape of Good Hope in Africa on those voyages, to Far East, to Europe and US East Coast mainly, isn't it? So Red Sea still kind of casting that long shadow, isn't it? I mean, it's amazing that we sit here and we're kind of like, oh yeah, Red Sea. One of the biggest kind of stories, for want of a better word, biggest stories in the history of kind of modern supply chains, and we're just kind of a little bit blasé about its impact now. But we shouldn't underestimate it, should we?
Can you imagine back when the Ever Given ship got stuck in the canal for, was it a week? If you had said back then, think of the noise a closure of the canal for a week gets, and here we are kind of 2 years on. And I mean, it's not closed, ships are still sailing through, but obviously the vast majority are still trying to avoid it. And I think to be frank, right, this was the section which we leaned on most from the outlook last year, because in reality very little has changed. We still have those same 3 scenarios with kind of continuation of what we have today. And it's true, there are more ships going through. A lot of them are CMA CGM ships. Some of those transit rely on the military presence there being delivered by nation states, but we're still far away from all ships returning. And I think even with talks now of a potential ceasefire deal and all the rest of it, we had that in January as well, and it didn't really land anywhere. There were a lot of questions suddenly about a return, but carriers were quite clear, we need to see more than this. And I think if back in January, the world felt like an easier place to manage than it does now, when you think about all the ups and downs we've had since the Trump administration. So there's definitely going to be a need from carrier sides to say, actually, we need this to be something we can hold and trust will last beyond a month or whatever. Because you don't want to be flip-flopping back and forth there, because it will require, I mean, the first thing when you get a return, there's going to be congestion issues, just like there was when we were kind of first setting up those networks. We saw in Southeast Asia, we saw in Barcelona in particular, quite a lot of transshipment that caused kind of congestion. The reverse would happen a little bit, where suddenly you'd get ships arriving, the last ships to go around Africa arriving in North Europe at the same time as the first ones to cross through Suez. So it would take some adjustment, and you don't want to go through that too many times. But on the flip side of that, when you do get that full return, because at some stage it will come, maybe not in 2026, but then we will see again this big drop in TEU mile demand. But I think the clear message now is we're seeing spot rates fall back to levels where they were at the end of 2023, before we got this TEU mile boost for the Red Sea. So kind of carriers were maybe hoping that this would keep rates up a higher level, but at the moment it's not. And I think that should be sounding warning bells on their side to say, well, if this is where rates are today, what happens when we get a return, and how do we make money off of this, because the reality is the costs for them, sure, it's more expensive in fuel, but they're saving quite a bit of money on those transit fees. So it's not like it's the cross pressures that will send them back, at least the majority. We might see CMA-CGM, we might see Costco going back sooner than the others, but not a large scale return. I don't think it's a relevant thing to talk about for the next 6 months even. Then we can see.
Yeah, but what if you're a shipper though? One thing maybe to keep in mind for 2026 is that this isn't a one size fits all for all carriers, is it? And you mentioned that Costco, CMA, CGM, especially if 2026 there is overcapacity of container shipping supply. All carriers are going to be fighting tooth and nail for shipper volumes, aren't they? It's going to be a real kind of contest to secure volumes. If some carriers are going back through Suez and some aren't, it's going to be a really interesting situation and something. I mean, do shippers kind of sit there and go, actually, I'll use it to my advantage. I know I can put my box on a Costco ship and get a shorter transit time. Why should I pay more to have a longer transit time with another carrier? Presumably these are kind of conversations that
they're the kind of conversation. I think the question is, do you do that before you've seen that it works? Or are you the shipper who says, I'll let other people do the first 5 transits and then I'll get on board? A little bit like we've seen with Gemini. I will go with Gemini, but I'm not going to pay extra for a higher reliability score because I don't believe it yet. So it's a little bit a question of, okay, who is willing to move first? Because of course there are also risks associated with it. It's not purely an economic decision, this. And that has to be borne in mind as well.
Yeah. So just to round off this theme, a little bit of kind of insight or guidance for shippers. If you're approaching your freight contract now, as you say, spot rates are dropping to kind of pre-Red Sea December 2023 levels. You should be thinking carefully about what percentage, what share of your freight rate should be assigned to a Red Sea surcharge on those operationally impacted trades, shouldn't you? Because it is kind of baked in now. The operational networks are kind of set, aren't they? So if you're a shipper, you should be thinking really carefully when a carrier says, "Here's a Red Sea surcharge."
Yeah, but also the other way, if you don't have a Red Sea surcharge, because if we say in July, the second half of the year, they return, then if you're the one who has, say you're paying a $1,500 all-in rate, you can be paying that as $1,500 in base rate and that's it, or you can be paying $1,000 base rate plus $500 Red Sea. It's going to be easier for you to say, well, this $500 should go because you've now returned. So it's on both sides, that balance is, and actually having it as a separate surcharge can also work in your favor should we get a return, and should you if you can push back on that. But like we're seeing now, in reality, rates are going down, whether that's because you're lowering the base rate, you're lowering the surcharge, rates are coming down, and that's the push from carriers. So it's a little bit nuanced, but it's not going to... I would be careful in trying to figure out and decide yourself how you want your rate split and how that sets you up for next year.
Yeah, there's always nuance. It's never straightforward, Emily. Never straightforward.
Think how short this podcast would be if there wasn't.
We'd be doing something else, wouldn't we? Trying to fill our time with other things, and we wouldn't want that. Penultimate theme in the Xeneta Ocean Outlook 2026 is around supply. So we've done macro, we've done geopolitics, we've done demand. The other kind of big pillar of ocean container shipping is supply. Interesting. Again, there's some nuance here, isn't there? As if we've not got enough already, but it's not straightforward. But we have a record order book for new ships currently. Emily, can you enlighten us a little bit more?
Yeah, so we have this record order book of 10 million TEU. I think perhaps slightly to my surprise, and I'm not the only one who are looking at this and thinking, why are carriers continuing to order these amounts of tonnage? But they are. In carriers' favour a little bit is that a lot of this tonnage is only going to be delivered from 2027 onwards. So actually we're looking in 2026, a fleet growth, think of around about 3.6%. So higher than demand growth, but less high comparatively than we've had the previous years, because we really had this situation of supply just really outgrowing demand, and that means we've have this built-in overcapacity. And even then, if you get a narrowing of 3% demand growth, 3.6% supply growth, that doesn't remove the overcapacity that's been built in. So it looks maybe tighter than it has done in previous years, but to us that doesn't look like a huge problem because all those ships are still there. They will come in different, different times. And actually what's interesting is for last year, we had MSC clearly as the biggest carrier in terms of new deliveries. This year, CMA CGM takes that top spot. So it's a slight change. Now, MSC is now so much bigger than the rest that, they're still getting a lot of new ships. It's not like they will suddenly be in trouble, but it's an interesting little shift there. We're seeing that in 2026, which in reality was a bit this lull because it was the ships that were being ordered kind of in 2023, 2024 when there wasn't so much money being made. And that's why we've got the lower delivery profile this year. And then it will speed up again when we get the end 2024, 2025 ships coming through. But yeah, slightly lower supply, but to us, this isn't a problem because the ships are still available. I think there's speaking of nuance here, there's something else that confuses me firstly in how much carriers want to order for the future, but also actually how much carriers are still willing to pay to get tonnage at the moment. Because it suggests that actually even though freight rates are falling, carriers are still willing to pay quite high charter rates to get new ships into their fleet. The idle fleet is still quite low, and we've still had, 5,000 TEU demolished. That's nothing. It's one medium-sized ship. So there's still a demand there for these ships. I think it might indicate that at the moment carriers are more interested in going for market share than necessarily trying to remove capacity to keep rates up. I think we'll see in 2026 how this develops. I certainly don't expect us to still be talking about an idle fleet of less than 1% in 3 months, let alone this time next year. I think at some point these freight rates have to come into play. But at the moment, we're not seeing that kind of huge kick in demolition or other things that would indicate that carriers aren't hungry to have this extra capacity, even though we can see on rates that they're struggling to fill those ships.
Yeah. Does it go back to the previous point around if there is, there will be overcapacity of supply next year, and there's going to be an almighty tussle for volumes and market share. Maybe are carriers how low can they go in terms of freight rates? That's the question, isn't it? And again, I imagine it varies from carrier to carrier how low they can go in terms of freight rates. But there is going to be maybe a bit of a price war. And again, let's finish this theme with a bit of insight guidance for shippers. They should know which carriers are expecting the deliveries in 2026. Which carriers are more exposed to overcapacity? Because actually, when you're talking to these carriers, you kind of know which ones really, really need your volumes. I mean, they all need your volumes, don't they? But yeah. But you get an understanding of the position of the person on the other side of the negotiating table.
No, absolutely. And this is then added. You cannot. But when we talk supply, you can't think only in terms of what's delivered this year because. All the ships that have been delivered for the past 20 years are still sailing out here. So it has to be seen in the context, but we can clearly see, okay, which carriers are going to be most pressed. And also, how are they going to react to it? But maybe that's jumping into the next topic ahead of time. So if we just wrap this one up, in theory, capacity is available for the demand growth that we're expecting, and it shouldn't be a huge issue. Like we said earlier, there will be some short-term things here and there as demand increases here and carriers adjust, and that takes time. But overall, as a picture, it shouldn't be a capacity issue next year.
Again, it's amazing, isn't it, how our themes seem to flow one after the other. And you're right, you have touched on the final theme in the Xeneta Ocean Outlook 2026, which is changing container shipping networks and the differing performance across carriers. Really pleased to have this theme in this year because it's a real enhancement from the outlook that we published last year because back in August, Xeneta acquired EC and their data and their people as well, their expertise as well, now part of the Xeneta team. So this theme is largely informed by that EC data around ship tracking and networks and reliability and such like. And that allows us to look at carrier reliability, performance, and such like, because Again, if you can kind of enlighten us a little bit, Emily, but if prices are dropping across carriers in 2026, what those carriers actually offer to shippers in terms of performance and reliability and all those other metrics, that's going to be even more important, isn't it? Because they're going to have to come with more to the table than that maybe they have done in previous years, where freight rates are really high and capacity was tight, and carriers like, well, do you want your box on the ship or not?
Yeah, and I mean, we've been saying for a few years now that you need to go beyond just the price. You need to have a relationship with your carrier, you need flexibility. And if anything, 2025 was kind of the perfect year to prove that you needed that, with all these jumps up and down, being able to get on the phone or get on the phone to your carrier or your freight forwarder and say, actually, I need to move stuff around is very important, as is service levels and transit times and all those kind of things that play in. And I think we're seeing this year that's for many, I mean, it was a topic for many shippers in the past, but I think it's become a topic for even more shippers, and in many cases it's been prioritized even higher than it has been in the past, which you'll kind of have more room to do when rates are falling and you're not, it's not a huge price increase. So we're definitely seeing that, and I think the carriers are well aware of that.
Also, we mentioned before about shippers learning the lessons from the past few years and being able to react kind of decisively at the right time against geopolitical disruptions and such like. This is kind of what we're talking about, is it not? That actually it's not just about price, it's about supply chain resilience and having an understanding of carrier performance, knowing what you're paying for and what you should be, was the service that you should be receiving, helps you to know what your transit times are and what your options are, so that if there is a tariff placed on Vietnam, or there's a return to the Red Sea and there's port congestion and all that kind of stuff, it means that you're able to react much more decisively, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think maybe just coming back to the discussion we were having in supply with blank sailings and capacity management, I think this is key for carriers next year. If they want to make money, it's about managing the capacity. But of course, I mean, it's a very consolidated market, but there are 9 major players. If we look at it, I mean, 10 if we take Zim with us as well. That all have to look at this, and okay, they have their alliances and they may be looking at it that way, but they all have to make a decision. Do we want to go after market share, or do we want to go after higher rates? And you can say when it's something that they can see that's relatively short term, like Golden Week at the moment, we're seeing plenty of blank sailings in October, as we usually would, with the drop in exports there after the holiday. They seem they're more willing to blank sailings. The question a little bit now is, okay, how much of that can you link directly to Golden Week, and how much of it is, okay, actually, the last hope we had for peak season is gone. We're now adjusting to these higher tariff levels and lower volumes. Do we, as a carrier, want to push and say, we'll add as much capacity as we can and we'll lose money, but we'll gain market share? Or do we say, actually, I want to remove the capacity and try and protect rates? And you have the prisoner's dilemma here, because you do kind of need the others to be on board with what you're doing. As soon as one or two are saying, I'm fine to lose some money for a while, I want the volumes, then that kind of ruins the party for the rest of them. And that is kind of on a global level, but it also then plays down on a trade by trade level. And we've had that discussion quite a few times here about those kind of capacity discussions and how carriers can sometimes ruin the party for themselves by adding capacity to the trades where they're earning the most money. And to me, that looks tricky. It's relatively logical to do when you've kind of got something relatively short term, Chinese New Year, during the pandemic. But if you're looking at kind of a whole year's worth of a struggle for carriers, then that becomes maybe trickier for them to kind of get the result they want.
Yeah, and we're not averse to a shameless plug of Xeneta on the freight debate, but this is kind of the point, though, isn't it? That the transparency that shippers have now in the market, so that they can look at the rates paid by the rates asked for by different carriers in the market, the blank sailings and the offered capacity. It brings the transparency that means that actually, as you say, maybe some carriers spoil the party for themselves, but shippers now have the ability to kind of look and say they have spoiled the party. They can take advantage of that situation.
Or I can see that you, my carrier, you're not offering, you're blanking all services here, you're not upping capacity. But I can see this other carrier is adding plenty of capacity, so I'm going to give them a call. And anything I haven't fully committed to my first carrier, I might try and get on the spot market with the second. So knowing that is hugely important.
Yeah. And again, let's round off the final theme with maybe a little bit of insight or guidance. And maybe I'm going to put this to you. When you buy something, and not necessarily ocean freight, when you buy something and the salesperson offers you, oh, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do the other, and then you buy it and then you never hear from them again and you don't really receive what you think you're going to be receiving. It's going to be, if we put it into the context of ocean freight, it's fine for a carrier to say, and maybe we'll talk about, Gemini, they had the really lofty reliability targets for this year and kind of achieved it on some of the trades. Well, did achieve it on some of the trades, to be clear. But my point is, it isn't a case of discussing this around the negotiating table when you agree your contract, your freight contract. This is about holding this data. Means you hold the carrier to account or the service provider to account during the lifespan of that contract. It's the time has come now, isn't it, where a shipper can really kind of say, well, I've given you my volumes when I could have given it to any of these other carriers. You need to make good on your promise. And they have the ability now to hold them to account.
Yeah, on that side, but also on the other side, and we're not the most carrier friendly on day-to-day, but this is also a tricky situation for carriers to deal with. So it's both kind of understanding, okay, this is what we agreed to. Great, you managed it for 6 months, but then this hit. And it's fine, we didn't hit the KPIs, whatever we had on that particular trade, but you responded better to this situation, whatever that may be, that actually this was more valuable than 100%. So again, it's this question of flexibility, but also making sure you can keep account of or keep a track of what they're doing compared to the competition and compared to what you agreed with.
Wonderful. So there's our 6 themes of the Xeneta Ocean Outlook 2026. I think it's a really thorough overview, but if you want to dive a little bit more deeper into the details and the data and the charts, then please go to the Xeneta website and you can download the Outlook and take a look at it for yourself. As a hugely popular download from our website in previous years, and I'm sure it will be again this year.
We've talked about the outlook. We haven't really talked so much about what this means for rates. So maybe we can tease a little bit with that we'll come back with the opinions, both positive and negative, we get from Summit, but also how this translates into rates more specifically on different trades. Because I mean, the headline here is it should be an easier year for shippers. You should be able to get lower rates in 2026 than 2025, but that's very high level. And we can come back to that in more detail next time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say, yes, maybe rates are falling, maybe tables are turning a little bit more in shippers' favour. But we can dive into the nuance of that as well. But again, disclaimer for the Ocean Outlook 2026. As we sit here on,
we need a jingle for disclaimers. We talk about it so often.
Well, I'll do like the adverts when you talk really, really fast, so no one can really hear what the disclaimer is.
I've been told I'm quite good at that, so just let me know.
Yeah, we just live in an incredibly volatile, unpredictable world, don't we? And we've seen in the past 4 or 5 years that anything can happen. So as you say, freight rates are dropping. Next week, anything could happen and it could all change again. And that's why Xeneta customers do get kind of regular updates throughout the year from Emily and Peter on the impact of these geopolitical disruptions, because it is a thankless task trying to predict the next 12 days, never mind 12 months in ocean container shipping. But thank you, Emily. I will see you in Barcelona in a couple of days for our Xeneta Summit.
Hopefully away from the Danish autumn rain.
Yes, it would be nice, wouldn't it? So thank you very much. As I say, really important document that we publish every year. If you want more information, then please visit the Xeneta website. But that's it for this special edition of the Freight Debate. If you liked it, please hit subscribe on our YouTube channel. And until then, from myself and Emily, we'll see you on the next edition of the Freight Debate soon. Thank you.